Welcome back, everyone, to Evidence Law 1 by KMVTECH Education. Today, we're diving right into Module 5, Lesson 2, Page 1. And this explainer focuses directly on a topic that honestly trips up a whole lot of law students, the shifting burdens of proof. Now, I really want you to treat this as building directly on what we covered in Lesson 1. In that previous lesson, we laid the groundwork, right? We defined the burden of proof, we looked at the two distinct types of burdens, and we covered the Section 102 test, along with the allocation of the legal burden and the presumption of innocence. So today, we're taking those static definitions and we're putting them into motion. We're going to examine exactly when and how the burden shifts during legal proceedings. And because these concepts require absolute precision, I'm going to be speaking a bit more slowly and deliberately today. I want to make sure you have ample time to get these critical notes down.
So here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with number 1, the concept of shifting. Then 2, criminal trials. Number 3, specific defenses. Number 4, civil proceedings. And finally, number 5, a discussion on tracking the spotlight. Let's get right into it. All right, part 1, the concept of shifting, or as I like to call it, the evidential spotlight. Now, when lawyers and judges in Uganda talk about the burden shifting, it's actually a massive source of confusion. A lot of people mistakenly assume the entire weight of proving the case passes from one side to the other. And let me tell you, that is a dangerous misconception to carry into an exam or a courtroom. We need to define precisely what is actually shifting.
So there's a stark difference between the two burdens we learned about back in Lesson 1. Please make sure you note this down carefully. The legal burden remains entirely static. It's like an anchor. In a criminal case, the prosecution bears the legal burden from the opening statements all the way to the final verdict. If the prosecution fails to prove every single element of the offense beyond a reasonable doubt by the end, the accused is acquitted. Absolutely nothing the defense does shifts this legal burden onto the accused. The evidential burden, however, is highly dynamic. I want you to visualize the evidential burden as a literal spotlight on a dark stage. At any given point in a trial, the spotlight of evidential obligation falls on one party. That party has to step into the light and adduce sufficient evidence to keep the relevant issue alive. Once they do that successfully, the spotlight physically moves across the room and illuminates the other party.
Moving on to part 2, how the burden shifts in criminal trials. Let's see how this builds when we apply our spotlight metaphor to a standard criminal proceeding. How exactly does this evidential spotlight move, step by step? At the very start of a criminal trial, both the legal burden and the initial evidential burden sit squarely on the prosecution. They are in the hot seat. They are in the spotlight. Step 1 is the prosecution calling its evidence. Witnesses, documents, physical exhibits, the whole shebang. Once they finish and close their case, we reach step 2. Here, the court stops and assesses whether the prosecution has actually adduced sufficient evidence to establish a prima facie case. If they have, well, then we move to step 3, where the accused is called upon to answer. The evidential spotlight has now shifted directly onto the accused, who must decide how to respond, whether by giving evidence themselves, calling witnesses, or simply relying on the weaknesses in the prosecution's case. So the absolutely crucial point here is understanding that step 2 assessment, what exactly is a prima facie case? I'm going to pause here so you can write this exact definition down. The defining standard comes from the case of Francis Xavier Kayemba v. Uganda. That's a 1983 High Court Bulletin case at page 330. A prima facie case is established when there is evidence on which a reasonable tribunal could convict if the defense offers no explanation. Let me repeat that for your notes. Evidence on which a reasonable tribunal could convict if the defense offers no explanation. That is the exact threshold the prosecution must meet to successfully pass the evidential spotlight over to the defense. But what if the prosecution completely fails to meet that Francis Xavier Kayemba standard? Well, if the court looks at the prosecution's evidence and decides no reasonable tribunal could possibly convict on it, the defense may submit that there was no case to answer. If the judge upholds this submission, the spotlight simply goes out. The accused is acquitted right then and there. The prosecution failed to discharge its initial evidential burden, so the spotlight never even shifts to the defense in the first place. All right, part 3, specific defenses and the shifting evidential burden. Now, let's look at a nuance that comes up all the time in practice and, for sure, on exams. What happens to our spotlight when the accused decides to raise a specific defense? When an accused person raises a defense like self-defense, provocation, mistake of fact, or an alibi, the accused bears the evidential burden of raising that defense. You can't just stand up in court and shout self-defense without backing it up. The accused must adduce sufficient evidence to make the defense a genuine live issue before the court. Once the accused discharges that evidential burden, meaning once they give the court just enough evidence to say, okay, self-defense is a real possibility here, the evidential spotlight bounces right back to the prosecution. The prosecution must now adduce evidence to counter that specific defense. And remember that absolutely critical final point? The legal burden of disproving the defense beyond a reasonable doubt never shifted. It remained anchored to the prosecution the entire time.
Okay, part 4, shifting in civil proceedings. We've spent a good amount of time in criminal court, but let's shift gears and look at the civil side. The rigid, structured shifting of a criminal trial, that doesn't really apply here. Civil proceedings are much more flexible.
The foundational rule here is statutory, so please write down this exact citation. Under Section 101 of the Evidence Act, Cap 8, the general principle is, he who asserts must prove. This simply means that as each party makes different assertions during a civil trial, they carry the evidential burden specifically for those assertions. The burden follows the assertion. This is a great way to illustrate the practical consequence of Section 101. In civil cases, burden analysis has to be done issue by issue, not just for the case as a whole. Think of a hypothetical contract dispute. The plaintiff starts by asserting a contract breach, so naturally, the plaintiff holds the burden of proving that breach. But then the defendant replies, wait a minute, that contract is actually void because you misrepresented the facts. Because the defendant is now the one asserting misrepresentation, the burden of proving that specific issue falls squarely on the defendant. If the defendant then asserts contributory negligence, well, they hold the burden for that too. It's like a ping-pong match. Whoever fails to discharge their burden on their specific issue loses on that issue.
Finally, part 5, discussion, tracking the spotlight. Okay, so we've covered the static legal burden, the dynamic evidential spotlight, the prima facie threshold, specific defenses, and the issue-by-issue civil standard. Let's put this all together and test your understanding with a practical scenario.
Here are the facts of our case. Let's say a woman is charged with murder in Kampala. It's a criminal trial, so right away we know the rigid rules apply. During the proceedings, the defense raises an alibi, which we know is a specific defense. They claim that the accused was actually attending a church service in Masaka, a town miles and miles away, at the exact time the murder occurred in Kampala. Let's follow the timeline of this specific trial. The trial opens. The prosecution begins by calling 3 eyewitnesses who place the accused near the scene. The prosecution case continues, and they call a pathologist who testifies strictly about the cause of death. Then, the prosecution closes its case. The court assesses things and finds a prima facie case does indeed exist. So we move to the defense case, and the defense calls a witness who testifies that they saw the accused at that church service in Masaka. So, here is your discussion question to review before you move on to the next page of the module. I want you to mentally track the spotlight of the evidential burden through this specific trial, from those opening statements all the way to the alibi witness. At each of the stages we just outlined, who is standing in the spotlight? Who bears the evidential burden? And precisely what must they do to discharge it and pass it back to the other side? Take your time, apply the rules we've just covered, and really try to visualize that moving spotlight. Because in a real courtroom, missing a single shift in that evidential spotlight doesn't just mean a failed exam. It can quite literally mean the difference between a conviction and an acquittal. Good luck, and I will see you in the next explainer.